Welcome everyone to the first of what we hope will be many educational webinars offered to the community. This webinar is being provided today in English. However, we welcome questions in French. Natalie Desrosiers is with us tonight to support with any French inquiries. This is guaranteed to be an informative, and knowing Clive as I do, an entertaining hour and a half. If we don't get to all your questions during the session, we will endeavor to respond to your questions via email after the session has concluded. For those not familiar with the Zoom features, we ask that you mute your line to avoid any background noise during the session. If you have questions, we ask that you submit those questions using the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen if you're on a computer. We have a lot of people joining us tonight, so we ask for your patience if we experience technical difficulties. So without further delay, I introduce Clive Milkins, who brings a vast background of knowledge to Canada in his role as technical advisor.
Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. For those of you that don't know who I am, as Christine's just said, I'm the technical leader for Para-Dressage in Canada. And when I'm not working with my Canadian hat on, I tend to work around the world looking at FEI, developing systems and programs all around the world for developing countries. To give you an idea of my background though, before I worked for the FEI and for Canada, I ran a therapeutic riding center in Maine in the USA. And before that, I managed a centre for over 20 years in the UK, where we ended up specialising in developing young disabled athletes, young para-athletes, from therapy into sport. So I actually have a therapeutic background as well. The centre that I ran is world renowned for developing young riders. And in fact, riders like Ricky Balshaw, Natasha Baker, and of course Sophie Christensen all came from the centre that I developed, all of whom are now multi medalists at world, European and Paralympic level. Anyway, that's enough about me. Welcome to this first webinar that I've done, and in England it's coming up to 25 to midnight, so if I appear a little bit jaded, I promise I won't nod off. I want to congratulate you. Well done for actually wanting to attend this and learn more about para-dressage. I'm very, very grateful that you've taken this time, especially on a Saturday evening when we've all got busy things and we're in a challenging time. So thank you very much. The purpose of this presentation, it's an overview of para-dressage in Canada. We're going to skip through the whole of the system tonight, and I'm sure you'll have many questions because in some cases it won't be as in-depth as you would like it to be. We've come up with this handbook in order to answer all your own questions so that when you want to follow this para-dressage route, you will be able to pick up the handbook, which is already online on the Canadian website, and start following through, and hopefully we will deal with some of your questions. So what is para-dressage? Well, para-dressage is aimed for sport, and it comes from the desire to create opportunities for athletes who have an impairment to compete and achieve some of their own goals in equestrian sports. And the first thing we have to understand is that para means parallel. It does not mean paraplegic, and I think in the past many people have walked away from para-dressage thinking it was for only one type of disability, but actually it is parallel to able-bodied, and therefore like able-bodied dressage, it's scored in exactly the same way as mainstream dressage. At international level, Para-Dressage is aimed for, but not exclusive to, individuals with a physical disability. Anybody that gets their classification can compete in Para-Dressage internationally, and we'll come on to that later. Para-Dressage was first developed in Europe with the idea of creating a meaningful opportunity for all athletes with an impairment to compete and achieve their goals. And it started in a very interesting way. Before 1952, dressage at Olympic level was only open to commissioned male military officers. But in that year, in 1952, Liz Hartle was the first woman to compete against men in a mixed gender equestrian sport at the Olympic Games. Her silver medal for the individual dressage was the first by any woman in an individual sport. But what made her medals so important, because she won another gold medal, another silver medal 4 years later, what made her achievement so important in terms of parasport was that in September 1944, at the age of 23, she contracted polio, which permanently paralyzed her below the knees and affected her arms as well. Hartle was determined to continue her equestrian career despite medical advice to the contrary. And most of the time, she had to be lifted on and off the horse. But once she was on the horse, she looked totally able-bodied and competed in mainstream dressage. But what we're looking at in Canada is para-dressage at all levels, from club and community level, because para-dressage can represent a unique opportunity to enjoy freedom and movement by learning to ride a horse, competing alongside friends and peers, and potentially progressing to high-level competitions such as the Paralympic Games. Next slide. The Canadian sports system is really working very hard at this because, like all sport, high-performance sport represents only a small number of athletes playing sport in general. There's a lot more athletes playing sport at grassroots, on club, therapeutic centres, and community and local level. We all know that sport is played by children and adults who just want to be recreational. They just want to have fun. Less than that go on to compete provincially and then nationally. But many, many people play important roles on that journey, and that any young person or any other person on that journey from local level to EC and Para, everybody that touches their lives can provide massive opportunities to learn, train, and compete at all different levels. Next slide, please. Here you see, this slide is really about the pathway athletes can take. Equestrian Canada itself is responsible for the development of para programs in Canada from grassroots to the international level. Equestrian Canada is our governing body for all equestrian sport and the equestrian industry in Canada. What everybody has to realise, though, is it's not a standalone organisation. EC does not arbitrarily make up its own rules for sport. EC is the national governing body, as I've said, and we are affiliated to the international organisation, the FEI. EC also works closely with Sports Canada and therefore links in to both the International Olympic Committee and the International Paralympic Committee. These two organisations govern all international Olympic and Paralympic sports. Next slide, please. These next few slides are a very clear pathway for human development. It's aligned to our able-bodied system and the system of other sports, therefore including parasports. So it's a standard gauge for where athletes are and how you get further. Of course, it's not a perfect formula. Nothing written down for human beings ever is. And I think you'll find that everybody, when they start, knows that somewhere it may not be at Olympic level, it may just be local level, or it may get to national level. We all stop somewhere on that journey. but this is a good system to work with. To give you an idea, and the figures in front of me are British figures. There are 30,000 registered athletes who ride that have an impairment. Of those 30,000 who are registered, 400 compete at para level, of which only 20 of those 400 out of the 30,000 compete regularly at international level. And of those 20, only 4 will go to a Paralympic Games. Competing for your country is not a given right. And in Canada, we're aiming to go to win, not just to go on holiday. Next slide, please. So again, this just covers what I've already sort of said. So next slide, please. So how do we turn riders into athletes? Well, for a start, different stages of athlete development require different time commitments. The LTA, the long-term athlete development system that you'll find in the handbook gives you a very good idea of what's involved time-wise. The first thing to look at when you're looking at, does your rider or do you think you have what it takes to be an international rider? The first thing I look for is not talent. In fact, talent and ability to ride is probably the easiest thing to train. What I look for is motivation. And ideally, even with the younger athletes, I'm looking for self-motivation. The child that wants to work harder. The child that demands more riding or demands homework or gets off the horse and does more stretches. They're the kids we're looking for. We also, at the early stages, need parental support. Because if the parent is not prepared to bring the child to riding sessions, or unfortunately, finance riding sessions, we can't go anywhere with it. If we have adults, it's got to be support from the partner and from the carer. And the whole time we're looking for drive and commitment to improve. Because that drive and commitment determines the level at which the athletes can aspire to be successful. Most of us, when we ride horses, are motivated to develop good riding skills so that we can enjoy our horses better. And if we're lucky, compete at the basic level. Very few are driven to participate in the international arena because that requires an enormous commitment of time, motivation, energy, and sadly, financial resources. So I think it's very important that at the early stages, athletes and their families are aware of those commitments needed for each level of competition. Coaches and athletes need to set realistic and achievable goals, in which case, most riders begin with their weekly riding sessions, probably in our case, riding in therapeutic centres, but you'll find some athletes of less impairment will be riding in riding clubs, maybe even grooming for other international athletes. And then as they get more interested and their skill level increases, the opportunity for additional guided practice sessions, or ideally more lessons, has got to be the next option. I think for me, the general guideline of a rider who wishes to move into competitive equestrian sport has to start riding at least 2 guided sessions a week, ideally as lessons with a good coach. But if not, at least supervised rides a week in order to work towards competing at EC bronze level and higher. EC, Equestrian Canada, strongly believes each athlete should be involved as possible in their own education and training. An athlete has to be accountable. They have to recognize that they can make mistakes, that's part of sport. but actually how they recover from their mistakes. And actually, you know, they've got to take accountability for their own actions and their own behaviour. We really would like our riders to know about how to prepare the horse before the session, putting a saddle and bridle on, maybe even what the horse has to eat, and also taking care of the horse after the session. Not everybody has the physical ability to groom a horse, but you're still going to know how to rub a horse down. And ideally, we want the riders to assist in the general stable management, even if it is cleaning tack. I think most riders can find a way of helping safely and develop more equestrian knowledge. And by the more they're around the stable yards and the barns, they develop more of a realistic idea of the commitment and work involved in riding as a sport. Once the basic riding skills are established, genuinely believe that the rider should take private lessons and then starts to attend clinics. I travel around Canada an awful lot, and there's no reason why you can't go to a clinic, have your session videoed and then sent to the office for us to assess, and find a good dressage coach who can assess the skill in relation to the various levels of competition. And also, the good competition coaches are able to assist with establishing competition goals. Discussing money is never easy, especially at the moment. But I think when athletes are starting to compete, they'll need to develop a competition budget with the assistance of a coach so that everybody knows the costs and the commitments before they start. Next slide, please. So, the guide to athlete classification is always a challenge. Classification is a vitally important part of the journey towards competition. The idea behind classification is it introduces fairness and a level playing field based on the physical limitations of a rider rather than their riding ability. And what it does is it provides riders with a physical disability the opportunity to compete against other riders with similar challenges. So we aim to be creating a level playing field. Now, this is where I get a little bit controversial. Janie Ann's already flinching, I can tell. I believe athletes wanting to compete should be classified quite early in their journey. Now, a few years ago in Canada, that wasn't possible because of the distances in the country. But now we have more classifiers and we are creating hubs where people can get classified more easily. The reason why I think it's important is because classification dictates which grade the rider competes in. Grade 1 riders walk. Grade 5 riders are riding virtually at Prix Saint-Georges. If you have a young person and you have them classified in such a way that you have an idea where you're going, it sets a realistic goal. If you have a young person with cerebral palsy, quadriplegia, the chances are they will not need to ride at Prix Saint-Georges. If the impairment is great, they will be a walk rider. So you'll know much earlier that they are ready to compete if they've got a walk test to do rather than walk, trot and canter. And I believe very strongly that some of the top grade 1 riders in the world, they don't trot, they don't canter, even in the freestyle, but they become the world's leading expert in walk. So I think it's quite important that people think about classification pretty early on in their competitive career. I'm getting ahead of myself now, talking about international competition. So classification, the rules for classification are based on the international guidelines for parasport and then made sport specific. They're not made up by a grumpy coach called Clive, who has a whim about what people can do. It's a recognized international process. And as I've said earlier, it's not based on riding ability. Riders are assessed by accredited classifiers, and then they're given a profile number, and the profile numbers are then split into the 5 grades that the International Paralympic Committee allow us to use. The classifiers are physios, usually, or doctors, and they test muscle power, joint range, and coordination. So as I say, there are 5 grades of competition in para-dressage. Grade 1, the more severely impaired riders. Grade 5, representing the least impaired riders. They still have to have 15% disability. During the classification procedure, riders and their coaches will probably be given approval to use particular adapted aids. And then these aids are written down on the master list. And again, they're there to create a level playing field. We have a separate webinar on compensating aids based around coaching and the need for adapted tack. So at both grassroots level and advanced. So we'll come back to that at a later date. Athletes have to have a minimal disability to compete the FEI criteria. And to quote the FEI, classification is neither intended to be comprehensive or to be all-encompassing. Para-dressage classification is not, by definition, inclusive. It does exclude people. Therefore, there is no legal liability to classify everybody. We're not saying by doing that somebody is not disabled, but sometimes they don't fit into the standard criteria for what the FEI are looking for. And that's cruel, and that's blunt, and that's harsh. In the same way, though, if you want to play soccer, you kick a ball. If you want to play rugby, you pick it up. The rules are just different, and we have to accept the rules. Next slide, please. Here we have a grade 1 rider. Athletes in grade 1. Next one, please. Sorry, Jamie Ann. Here we have a grade 1 rider. Athletes in grade 1 have severe impairments, and it affects all their limbs and their trunk. You will usually find an athlete in grade 1 requires the use of a wheelchair. They may be able to walk with an unsteady gait, but their trunk, their core stability, and their balance is severely impaired. You usually find athletes in grade 1 are neurologically impaired as well. So quadriplegic cerebral palsy, multiple sclerosis, and high-level paraplegics are all competing successfully. If you're interested in the grade 1 classes, have a look at Sophie Christensen from Great Britain, Sarah Morganti from Italy, and Laurentia Tan from Singapore. They are all world-class international grade 1 riders. In Canada, my top riders who've competed at Paralympic and World Games include Jodie Schloss and Winona Hartson. Grade 1 riders, as I say, perform their tests in walk, but it has to be a very accurate test. 8-meter circles, 3 halts in the test, and there are lots of changes of bend and fluency in the test. And the horse must maintain a good active marching rhythm. Athletes in grade 1 are allowed to trot in the freestyle if they want to do a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with that. All I would say, though, is if you start trotting and you start riding too much above your grade, sooner or later classifiers and people will start thinking, are they in the right grade? Next slide, please. Grade 2. Athletes in grade 2 have a severe impairment of the trunk and probably minimal impairment of their upper limbs, or maybe moderate in their trunk and all 4 of their limbs are affected. Most athletes in this grade will use a wheelchair for longer distances and will get tired pretty quickly. Top athletes in this grade include Peppo Puck from Austria. He was an international event rider before he had an accident, and he rode his 4-star event horse to win a gold medal in the London Games in 2012. Other riders to look out for in grade 2 are Sir Lee Pearson from Great Britain and Stinne Tang from Denmark. So athletes in this grade walk and trot. They cannot canter in the freestyle, and in the main tests, they have leg yield, length and strides, and again, some pretty nasty halts to practice as well. Next slide, please. Grade 3 riders have usually severe impairments in both their lower limbs, or with a minimal or no impairment of the trunk, or moderate impairment of the upper and lower limbs and the trunk. So there's less disability, but still pretty much all of the rider's body is affected. Natasha Baker from Great Britain is the best known international grade 3 rider, with our own Loren Barwick competing very successfully at world and Paralympic level. The athletes in grade 3, probably 60% trot, 40% walk. They have to rein back, leg yields in trots, and unlike the grade 2 where they were showing lengthened strides, these athletes have to show medium trot strides. And they have a particularly tricky 3 and 4 loop serpentine in trot with a walk transition across the middle. Next slide, please. So grade 4 riders is when we start introducing the canter work. They will have an impairment or a deficiency in both the upper limbs or a weakness in all 4 limbs. Athletes of grade 4 are usually able to walk and usually do not require a wheelchair in everyday life. Grade 4 athletes also include the visually impaired riders. If you're visually impaired, you are classified by international ophthalmologists, with B1 being the most disabled and B3 being the least disabled. Usually at B1, it's very difficult to even define light and dark in a test. You used to have to wear a blindfold. Now they've taken that out of the rules. But at grade 4, athletes walk, trot and canter. They have half turns on the haunches in walk, medium trot and medium canter, rein back, and we introduce shoulder in and counter canter. Next slide. Grade 5 riders, these are the least disabled, if there's such a way of putting it, who are eligible for para. They still have to have a minimum of 15% disability. There is usually one severe abnormality or deficiency in one limb, or a mild problem in 2 limbs. Usually at this point, the trunk is pretty okay. We also get the visual impairment athletes at B2, and they have a higher visual acuity than those in grade 4, but it's still less than 5 degrees. The top riders at grade 5 are often competing able-bodied at Prix Saint-Georges into 1, into 2 and above. Sophie Wells and Frank Hosmar, or Sophie Wells from Great Britain, Frank Hosmar from Holland, have both represented their country at small tour level, able-bodied. And our own rider, Lee Garrett, has also competed at into 1 and into 2 level. So in the grade 5 tests, they have half passes in the trot and canter. You're allowed to do tempi changes in the freestyle, but so that you don't have to have a very, very smart horse that does changes, it's still simple changes and counter in the straight tests. In the freestyles, they're also allowed half pirouettes in canter, but they're not allowed full pirouettes. So at the moment, we recommend riders should become classified when they're intending to compete at EC Silver, Gold, and then the international classes. I still maintain if you can find a local, and I know that's not so easy in Canada, a local friendly classifier, having a rough idea of which grade you are will help deciding when you start to compete and what level you train towards. Any riders that are listening tonight who are interested in becoming classified, contact Jamie Ann at the office and she'll give you an information pack. And to briefly go through that, the riders must complete a classification request form and have a consent form, and also from their doctor a certificate of diagnosis, because we need to know that actually you're eligible before we start. Once the documentation is filled in, you then talk to the classification advisory group about the eligible impairment, and then they will assess the need for classification. One of the other reasons for doing this is should you want to compete able-bodied in Canada, we have a dispensation certificate, which is issued annually from the office. It's the responsibility of the athlete to request in writing the renewal of the dispensation certificate, because that again allows for your adapted equipment. If you can prove that you have memory loss, you can have your test called. But again, you've got to have that done by the doctor. It's also the responsibility of each competitor to ensure that all compensating aids used in competition have been approved by the Classification Advisory Board. And more, as importantly, documented correctly on their certificate classification profile. Approval of these compensating aids is dependent on whether the equipment or modification to equipment or specific aids are permitted through classification. More, as importantly, they have to be approved for safety and consider the well-being of the horse. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's the complicated bit out of the way. So how do we get started? Well, dressage in para is exactly the same as dressage in mainstream. Horses and riders simply complete a set of movements in an arena. The arena is either 40 by 20 or 60 by 20, exactly the same as able-bodied. Usually in para, the grades 1, 2 and 3 are always in a 40 by 20. Some of the grade 4 and 5 tests can be done in a 40 by 20, but internationally they're done in 60 by 20. Exactly the same as able-bodied. The movements are predetermined, decided 4 or 5 years in advance, and all the riders ride the same test. The only difference, of course, is the freestyle, where they have a set of movements, but they can be done to music in your own order. But in the early stages, you can even ride a dressage test on the lead rein for safety. In the early stages, you don't even need to travel away from home. EC is one of the world leaders at running a series of video competitions throughout the years. we actually start to use those video competitions for talent spotting. So that once you start getting good scores, I start paying attention. We also use highly qualified, highly trained Canadian and international judges, so that we're already from the word go creating a pathway for those who want to take this further. And I think we also have to remember that dressage is simply a French word that means to train. So yeah, on one level, we are talking about a sport that is parallel to able-bodied dressage. But I think for me, the true value of developing
Please be patient with us. We're having a few technical difficulties. We're just trying to get Clive back on the session, so please just bear with us for a moment.
Right, according to my phone, I'm back, so I will carry on from where I was before. Sorry about that. Technology's gone to bed over in England. So for me, dressage is still about therapy. It's still about developing riders to be better balanced, more coordination, fitter and stronger. And a good riding position is the same as a good physical posture. So sport is, for me, very good therapy. And in fact, in our sport, the only difference between able-bodied and para is the degree of difficulty. And that's the only difference. Para-dressage demands the same qualities of riding performance, the same knowledge, the same training of the horses. And just like any athlete, the level of dedication, determination, education, and the quality of training and horsemanship and sportsmanship as well as horsemanship is required as the same as any other athlete. So our sport is judged exactly the same as able-bodied. It's judged on the way the horses perform a set floor pattern of movements. Rhythm, balance, harmony are paramount. And so for me, you don't need to have an all singing, all dancing, multi-million-dollar horse. Any horse that is healthy, sound, has correct paces, a good temperament, and a good basic training can complete a dressage test for 65 to 70%. And believe me, I know this is true. I've trained horses and worked with horses at international level, and I've trained Arabs, Welsh ponies, New Forest ponies, Clydesdales, Spanish horses, as well as the warm bloods. If a horse walks, trots, and stops when it's told to, and you can start to show the beginnings of the bend on a circle, you have the basic requirements to complete your first dressage test. And as long as your coach understands about accuracy, understands about safety, understands about the soundness of a horse and the correct training, a good therapeutic coach will help you through your first adventures into dressage. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So what do you need for competition? Well, I'm a bit of a traditionalist, so I still would like the top hat and tails that they use in able-bodied dressage, but with modern safety, Para has never ever used a top hat. It's always been a crash hat with a proper fitting chin strap, and it always will be. But in the early stages, the clothing is pretty simple. For the video competitions, an up-to-date or correct riding hat is obviously needed. But other than that, safe and comfortable riding attire is all that you need. Safe footwear. And as long as you look neat and tidy as much as anything else. And I think, again, part of an athlete being accountability, after a while, riders should be prepared to purchase their own clothing and equipment. I think it's very important that athletes are familiar with and comfortable in their own riding attire when they're competing. I would point out that most boys, me included, do not like wearing a shirt and tie. And I would also say that actually competitive dressage and competitive riding, we are one of the few sports that wear different clothes when we're competing than we do when we're training. So that's the sort of thing that we should be rehearsing at home. Tell you a little story. A little boy I was working with who had Down syndrome was doing his first dressage test. He went down the centre line on the lead rein, suddenly looked at his horse's mane and realised the horse's mane were in lots of little knots. Now, one of the first things that he was taught was to brush the knots out of the horse's mane. So as he halted at X, he stopped and started picking at the knots in the mane. Now, any horse person would, of course, realise that those knots were braids. But this little boy was determined he was not going to do his dressage test until he'd finished taking the knots out of the horse's mane. We got it sorted out, but after that, we started to realise you need to rehearse in the riding kit you're going to compete in, and that includes dressing the horses the same. Obviously, for dressage, we like jodhpurs or breeches, they're preferred. And tall boots don't need to be worn. Half chaps look very smart and are still very protective of the lower leg. And that, again, half chaps are allowed at all level of competition, including international. And of course, it goes without saying that clothing should be close fitted and tucked away for safety. Ideally as well, gloves should be worn, but there will be some cases where they can't be worn, and that's fine. They do not have to be white. They can be black. If a rider has a flail arm and they don't want to show the gloves and the hands moving around, black gloves are perfectly okay. Next slide, please. I think one of the things that's really important for me is as you develop competitively, you have to create a good support crew. In this case, in this particular video, we have Caroline, our team therapist, giving the athletes a massage. But things like making sure that your carer or your parent has the responsibility to get you to the competition on time. and properly dressed. Did have a situation once many years ago where I was teaching a rider, I was helping a rider at a competition, and I thought, that's odd. Her foot is stuck out much more than usual. When she got off, her carer had put her shoes on the wrong feet. So you need to develop a good backup crew as well. And they're a backup crew that are going to keep the rider relaxed and calm. There's nothing worse than an apprehensive mother or somebody who is late that is not helping you perform at your best. Next slide, please. And this just shows you, I really like this photograph. This was Roberta Sheffield at WEG 2 years ago. I think it's a very interesting photograph. This is the team around her before she's about to go in the arena. You see the groom is pretty close and paying attention. The coach is pretty close, paying attention. We also have in the background the team manager and the team vets. Yes, they're there monitoring the horse and supporting however they within their role, but they're not crowding the rider. Everything is calm and relaxed. It's a world championship, no big deal. A is in the same place as it is for any local show. And I think the point is here that this demonstrates it's not a party, it's a competition, it's serious. And I aim to get the support crews like a professional pit stop crew. Everybody knows their job. Everybody knows when to do their job, and when they don't need to do their job, they drift quietly into the background and support. And that's really important for me. Next slide. Competition horses. Funnily enough, it's a bit difficult to do dressage if you don't have a competition horse. But what does that mean? As I said earlier, when I ran a therapy centre in the UK, my therapy horses doubled up as competition horses, and they had absolutely no problem doing it because they were trained to be rhythmical, calm, balanced, and soft. So there's no reason at all why well-trained therapy horses cannot do this sport. They've just got to be sound and healthy. Next slide, please. I think as you progress, riders and coaches should turn toward leasing or buying your own horse. But as I say, the real key here is not flashy movement or expensive bloodlines or black ones or grey ones or whatever. It's safety and training. Because they are your partner. You're relying on them for safety. And they've got to look after you, and you've got to guide them around the arena. As I say, I've used Arabs, Welshes, Frisians. And in international, any horse over the age of 6 can compete internationally. And it doesn't matter whether they're a mare, a gelding, or a stallion. We don't have that many stallions in international para competitions, but they are there. And Dunham won 2 silvers and a gold in Rio on a very, very quiet, reliable stallion. He had a good walk and a great temperament. I think for me, it's very important that the para-dressage horse is regularly trained by an experienced rider or trainer or coach. You notice that I say trained. I didn't necessarily say ridden. But an experienced pair of eyes on the ground on a regular basis, whether it's a judge, a coach, or somebody riding a horse, is really important. But then I think your therapy horses should be ridden on a regular basis by an able-bodied rider. No, they don't have to work at advanced levels. But if your therapy horses are ridden by riders who are a little bit asymmetric, we need to reprogram them. We need to put their backs comfortable. We need to look after our horses. Horses are horses, whatever their breed, whatever their job, they're still equines. And so good training for your para horse, for riding the rhythm and the straightness and the balance is always so important. Of course, when you're looking for your competition horse, coaches should always checking for safety. No matter how expensive your horse is, if he's naughty or spooky or won't go down the centre line because he's frightened of a flower pot, he is not a reliable partner in competition. Riders at the lower grades, grades 1, 2 and 3, can always have their horses warmed up for them at a competition. The only rules are you can only ride the horse for 30 minutes a day, and the able-bodied rider has got to be off the horse 15 minutes before the disabled rider does the test. But the horses can be ridden before the competition by a coach. Grade 4 and 5 riders do not have that luxury, but they can have the horse lunged by a member of their support team. Competition horse is just like a good therapy horse, obedient, reliable, and content to keep moving. What we don't want, although we want a nice, steady, relaxed horse, if the riders have got to keep kicking and they use all their strength to get the horse to go, they'll have no strength left to ride the horse correctly through a competition test. So I always look for a good walk. And by a good walk, the horse's walk must be 4 beats and marching. Good competition horse should be attentive to the aids and willing to listen to the rider's aids for turns, transitions, and accuracy. Good competition horse has no health issues. A good competition horse is sound. We do not put disabled horses, we do not put disabled athletes on disabled horses. So in the trot must be a diagonal 2-beat movement that is rhythmical and balanced. Interestingly enough, in para, you have the choice of either rising or sitting in the trot. You don't have to do one or the other. And I think if you've got a good rhythmical trotting horse, adding rising trot to the mix can be a little bit complicated as well. So as I say, I believe that when you're starting competition horses, they're exactly the same as good therapy horses. With a regular schooling program, a calm temperament, rhythmical, straight and balanced paces, most horses will learn a correct way of going and therefore make good competition horses. I think as well, a trainer or a coach riding a therapy horse once or twice a week maintains their muscle tone, it keeps them sweet, and they can do something fun as well. Okay, next slide, please. Caring for the competition horse. I mean, in many ways, it's pretty straightforward. Welfare and soundness is the vital component of any horse. And in the FEI, we always talk about the horse being a happy athlete. I don't know that horses are happy being athletes. I think they're quite happy out in the field eating grass. But they've got to be in good condition, fit for the job. So for a grade 1 horse, it does not need to be as fit as a grade 5 horse. And in that case, older horses can actually very often do their job. It should go without saying that veterinary care in all areas is so important. Regular farriery work, regularly having their teeth checked, and of course ensuring the horse is pain-free and sound. FEI horses also have to have all their documentation as well with injections. You know, caring for your competition horse means the saddles must be checked regularly. If the horse has a sore back or his tack doesn't fit properly, the horse can't be trained. He can't advance in his training, and he certainly won't do well in competition. Next slide, please. Tack and equipment. as I say, we'll run a specific webinar on adaptive equipment in the future, so watch the space for that. But the rules are pretty simple for permitted saddlery and competition. It's virtually identical to able-bodied, and it's all the rules are on the website. The saddle must fit the horse and the rider, and should put the rider in a functional riding position. When you start looking at adapted equipment, I would recommend that you consult the EC rules and the classifier, as there are strict guidelines for saddle adaptation. I'm not going to go through it now because it's all in the rule book. Side saddles are allowed, and Western saddles are allowed too. Of course, bridles must also fit the horse. Both snaffle, you can use snaffles and double bridles. And I believe the athlete and the coach needs to know the function of each piece of equipment before they use them. For me, although you can use a double bridle, the judges and the stewards have the right to ask you to remove it if there's a welfare issue. You don't have to have a double bridle, and it should complement the horse's way of going. And frankly, 9 times out of 10, if the horse is going badly in a double bridle, the judges are just going to say it shouldn't be in a double bridle, even if that's not the real reason. So I tend to try and stick to snaffles. And as I say, the rules are on the website. Next slide, please. I think this is a very, very interesting slide and a very interesting discussion point. Para-Dressage needs its therapeutic riding coaches. They have a vitally important role to play in our sport. The therapeutic riding coaches spot talent. They recognize the child who sits beautifully. They recognize the child who wants to do more. They recognize the person that wants to put the effort in, go home and read a book, gets very upset when their lessons are cancelled because of a virus. And it's when the therapeutic coach recognizes that talent that the magic really starts to flow. Next slide, please. And the reason why the therapeutic coach is so important is because they facilitate this easy transition into sport. And they do that quite simply by developing correct coaching. Good therapeutic posture is a good riding position. Following the horse's movement for therapy, riding the rhythm, and let's face it, I can only ever remember to spell the word rhythm by rhythm helps your 2 hips moving. It's the only way I can remember how to spell it, because that's what therapeutic riding does. And every rider we work with will have a head, some form of trunk, and something to sit on. So we get the riders in the right position for the word go. We get their education about accuracy, sitting still. And we have the makings of somebody who can do a competition test. And incidentally, even the top riders I work with in Europe, even when they were training 3-4 times a week towards a world championship or a Paralympic Games, they would still have at least 1 session a week on a therapy horse, improving their position. So the good riders that come from therapy will always tag in and tag back to therapeutic riding because we recognize the value of it. And then I find that the good coaches want to improve their own knowledge, so they follow their riders. And I think if you look at, although we talk about a good support network, very often the therapeutic coach is the one to help the rider into sport and is the one to be the good support. And I think as coaches as well, we've got to have no ego. I think it's very important that we recognize that actually when our own knowledge is, we don't have any more knowledge to give the riders, we either learn more knowledge or we find another coach. And then you find that for a few weeks that the other coach will come in, help the therapeutic riding coach, and I call it team coaching, which is for me very important. Next slide, please. So when we look at this next slide, we have lesson plans. In the LTED, we talk about fundamentals, or fundamental sport skills is the same as fundamental posture. I don't altogether agree with this slide because I'm quite happy to be controversial. I tend to start riders without stirrups. If I know my horses, I tend to find, unless the rider is a paraplegic or has a lower limb amputation, I always work with the seat and the core stability first, following the horse's natural movement. We always work on the independent seat, independently balancing and sitting up straight. And symmetry are the cornerstone to good posture. They're the cornerstone to good posture in physical therapy, and they're a good cornerstone in position when it comes to riding. Not every rider has limbs. If they do have limbs, which most of us do, they don't always function correctly. The seat, the head, and the trunk are the place to start. Teaching the rider to hold the reins correctly and to lengthen and shorten the reins can be extra skills, sometimes taught away from the horse. If the rider has a difficulty in gripping the reins, we can practice that on the back of a chair, watching a video at home, working out how your elbows move, because the fingers hold the reins, yes, but I can show you riders that have the reins actually velcroed to their hands because they can't hold the reins properly. So, but the elbows act as the contact, no problem at all. Exercises like running up the stirrups, although I still think that's a very weird explanation, is how on earth does somebody run up stirrups? Loosening the girth, maybe even leading the horse back to the stable, they're all extra activities that are appropriate for the individual needs. Always develop a rider's skills through progressive system. The LTED works really, really well. And as the rider acquires balance and becomes accustomed to the movement, controlled relaxation allows him to follow the horse's movement with the seat and the pelvis. That's stability. That's posture and position all in one. I always teach correct aids for all paces, transitions and school figures. Effective riding position and accuracy is the real key for effective and correct riding position and accuracy, the real key to a good sports rider. We talk about goal setting all the time, but it's goal setting could be a lesson, it could be a week, it could be a month, but it's tiny, attainable, tickable targets. Ideally, of course, we want private lessons, but they're not always possible. But several riders with similar goals actually can make good progress riding in a semi-private lesson. And riding in small groups positively stimulates fun, gentle bit of competitive environment for those who like to be pushed. Riders working in a group environment must work as a team to keep their distances, riding deeper into their corners, maybe even when you get really clever, lengthening and shortening the length of strides, maintaining accuracy in the school. But they also start to help you work out how to become independent, how to develop riding skills in a warm-up arena. All these things, they're life lessons, they're therapy lessons, they're sport lessons. Next slide, please. And I think the other thing is we talk the whole time about competition being a big dramatic thing. Now I get it that in Canada, it's not that easy to pop to a competition like it is in the UK. When I first started working in the therapeutic centre, we had one competition a year. And then that got so big, we had 2 competitions a year. Now in Para, you can compete 48 out of 52 weekends of the year. But 25 years ago, our first national championship was 2 hours at the end of the Pony Club Dressage Championships. And we literally purloined a judge, gave a judge an extra bottle of wine, and we borrowed an arena for 2 hours. Now, the RDA National Dressage Championships are the biggest single annual disability sporting event in the world. And we have 900 athletes competing over 4 days. And that's only happened in 25 years. Canada can do exactly the same thing. But how do we do that? In-house fun day competitions within the regular riding sessions. We have in England, there's a great competition called Countryside Challenge, which doesn't have any dressage in it, but they might have to ride around a duck pond. No, there are no ducks in it, but a blue paddling pool. That's a 10-meter circle. They might have to ride through some cones. That's a 3-loop serpentine. Stop between 2 cones and thank the farmer for opening the gate for them. And this is a competition that you can build within the poles and the other games equipment that you'll find in your therapeutic riding centres. And it can be done in-house. And you can, if there are 3 or 4 coaches working at the centre, you just invite one of the other coaches to come and judge your session. So they get a slightly different person coming in. The lower level test at the beginning can be done on the lead rein. We just want to get more riders competing in competitions. Maybe after that, maybe a local competition will include classes for riders with disability. And the most important thing for me, as already mentioned, is the EC Para-Dressage competitions. We have good judges. It's very easy. If you've got a 40 by 20 meter arena, it's very easy to get one rider videoed and have the video sent off to Equestrian Canada. It's a vitally important part of what we do, and I would love to see it more and more uptake. You don't have to leave your facility. You just got to have somebody standing at sea with a video camera, and all the rules are there, and there's plenty of written advice on how to use the cameras as well. And of course, after that, it's pretty simple to go and do the bronze level EC competitions. Next slide, please. I think I've probably just covered all that anyway. So next slide, please. When it comes to the video competitions, any rider with a physical and or intellectual impairment are welcome to compete in the video competition series. They do not need to be classified in order to compete. They simply just have to have themselves recorded. There is no restriction on clothing or on tack. And because it's a video competition, all adapted equipment is fine. All I would like to say is the coaches have some form of competition experience in the discipline they're teaching, but that's all. And any rider can do these video competitions. Any rider that can follow instructions and ride the required movements in the correct sequence can do the video competition. The tests can be called. So it's pretty easy for me. Next slide, please. Again, this is a pretty self-explanatory slide. One thing I know about therapeutic riding coaches and therapeutic riding volunteers is they are organized. They are very good at health and safety, and they are very good organisers. I am sure that most people could organise a fun day and a lower level competition without it being too much of a challenge. And all that someone's got to do is read the rules. Next slide, please. So we now start looking at the tests, and they are designed for all riders. So as I said, bronze level, they're not required to be classified at any bronze competition. All they've got to do is submit their dispensation certificate if they need compensating aids. We have 3 walk tests for riders who want to compete at walk, 3 walk and trot tests for those who want to trot and walk and trot, and 3 tests for walk, trot and canter. So again, no rider is stuck to doing 1 test. They're in a little bit degree of difficulty, and you just progress when you want to. Next slide, please. So from silver and gold, athletes need to be classified to compete in those competitions. And for silver and gold, we use the EC Para-Dressage tests. And we start to use the FEI Para tests as well. They're all on the website, and they start to become more challenging, but that's competition is about personal goals and achievements. Next slide, please. And then we have the FEI tests. The FEI tests have intro tests and novice tests, as well as the team, championship, and freestyle. And 1-star and 2-star competitions use the novice and the intro tests, although I don't understand why they use the same freestyle test as the 3 stars. 1-star competition will be your first attempt at an international, and you get to, and it's all about the level of judges. And then 3-star competitions, you will always have the FEI team test and the individual test and the freestyle. Well, that's all on the website, and that really covers. We've literally galloped through para from start to finish. So I'd now like to open the floor to any competition, any questions.
So we have one question from Helen Richardson. If we're just starting to work with a para-athlete, where can we find out what compensations can be used so that we can incorporate them into our training if necessary before we go to the point of classification?
Come to the next webinar and I'll show you all my adapted equipment. There's, in all seriousness, if you look on the FEI website, there is a set of, there are plenty of photographs on different pieces of adapted equipment that can be used. The real key for adapted equipment is to use what you need. And then if there's a specific rider's case, by all means send me an email and I'll have a look to see if I can advise you. It's a bit difficult to do it on sort of, when I don't know who the rider is or their disability or anything like that. But the FEI have a complete list of allowed compensating aids and adapted equipment, and I'm very happy to look at each rider individually to see if I can help.
We have another question from Birgit Valkenborg. Are ponies allowed in international para-dressage competitions?
Yes, there is no height restriction on the ponies at all. And I have seen 13.2s, or what are they now? 138 and 148. I don't think I've seen anything smaller, but certainly I've seen 13.2s and 14.2s being used.
And a follow-up question from Birgit. Clive, are you saying that video competition should be the first competition before going to a showground?
Yes. Certainly with children who have been maybe born with a disability and are in a therapeutic riding centre, I think the video competitions are a very, very good idea to get the feel of the floor patterns and to rehearse. So children that aren't used to wearing jackets, shirt and ties, braided horses, do it at home where you're only changing one thing at a time. I think if you have an athlete who has had an acquired disability, i.e. maybe an adult or a young person who's had an accident, if they already know what the show environment is like, then possibly no, they don't need the video competition. But for children with learning impairments, children and parents who have no idea what a show is all about, I would say do a video competition so that you've got the floor pattern in your head before you go. And secondly, go and visit a show, showground before you ride, so that you don't become eyes out on stalks when you get there.
We have a question from Lena Beliveau. What level tests should we be submitting for video competitions if we are hoping to get noticed?
Doesn't matter where you start, it's where you finish. So I would start at a good level that your rider is happy with, and because there are walk video competitions, this is what I mean, you see, because we've got walk video tests, you can start at any stage. And what I tend to do is when you've done one test and you've got sort of 69 to 70% at that one test 3 times, then move on to a more difficult test. And that's when you put your trot in or whatever. Doesn't matter where you start so the rider has a good competition, start so the rider has a happy experience, and go from there.
A question from Jennifer Benton. I'm in the US and I'm a physical therapist. I'm interested in becoming a classifier. Where should I go to learn more?
If you are a US physical therapist, you should probably contact Tina Wentz at the USEF.
Birgit Volkenborg has another question. What advice could you give to a coach who is new to para-dressage?
Enjoy it. My story, I was in a therapeutic riding center and I met a young child with quadriplegic cerebral palsy whose speech wasn't very good. And I just knew she was on the lead rein with 2 side helpers, and she was going through puberty. She was a pretty difficult teenager, and I just knew she had the X factor. She had something about her, and her name was Sophie Christensen. And I have this sport, watching young people develop from therapy into sports, whatever the level they get. And I come back to the other question. It took 15 years for Sophie to get from a therapeutic riding to winning 3 gold medals in London. And that was only in walk. So riding is a late maturation sport, so it doesn't matter how long it takes. But anyone that's new to it, get a couple of good books on dressage. And I don't mean necessarily the complicated ones. There are a couple of very good books. One of Arthur Cottas's book, he has a whole chapter on the walk. So get a good book on dressage, understanding the horse's basic paces, understand a rider's position, and just practice and have fun with it. And don't be afraid to ask questions. There are plenty of people in Canada, there are plenty of good people in Canada who will give you all the help and advice you need. Just ask questions. And, anybody that wants to email me privately, Jamie Ann will give you my email address. And I do a lot of work on Facebook as well. Just enjoy it. It's given me an amazing career, and I hope other people have as much fun as I do.
Our next question is from Taylor Campbell.
Oh,
Hi,
yeah.
Clive. Great job. We're
Thank
obviously
you,
in a
Taylor.
We're obviously in a unique situation due to COVID with no competitions or classifications. So in terms of intermediate next steps, what would you recommend? Can those who are feeling keen after this reach out to you or EC to ask questions or submit videos for feedback?
Yes. I mean, I'm in lockdown in the UK, so I don't not altogether sure what's happening in Canada right now. I know our Prime Minister is going to talk to the nation tomorrow. Our therapeutic riding centres are the same as the Canadian centres in that athletes and young people who need a lot of help will not yet be able to ride because of the social distancing. We are beginning to look at athletes who are independent, maybe even if they're independent and their parents can help them get on and off. We're looking at the therapeutic riding centres in the UK, like everywhere else, need money to survive. So we're looking at starting some form of lesson program again. Those that aren't able to ride, and obviously safety is more important than short-term riding. There are so many good videos on YouTube. Sophie Christensen does a very good blog on Facebook and on Instagram. Natasha Baker is doing some good stuff. So there's a lot of people out there putting stuff like Canada is out on the website. So if you're keen, you can go onto YouTube, you can go onto the internet and start searching books and videos on how to improve. And of course, Taylor being a physio, there's no reason why you can't be doing your physio exercises, your stretching, and starting to look at good nutrition and education right now.
We have a question from Brianna Tensey. I've done an FEI Para Grade 1 test in training at my therapeutic riding center in the US, and I'm classified as a Grade 1. Is there any way I can send it to a judge for review?
If you're a US rider, probably talk to USEF and Michelle Asseling. You should be able to, because I know, obviously Michelle being the American coach, he used to be my coach and we worked very closely together on the British team. So I know that the US system is pretty similar to the Canadian system. If you ask Michelle, there are judges out there internationally who will look at a test for you.
Anne Sophie Prevost asks, if I keep competing in able-bodied competition, I really like this. Do you recommend to start para-dressage categories too?
I think because there are limited opportunities for para classes at the moment in Canada. If you are able to compete in able-bodied dressage, the more experience you get of competing, the better. Go for it.
Susan Clark asked, is there more information in the handbook about intellectual disabilities and how these are classified?
That's a pretty challenging question at the moment. At the moment, athletes with cognitive impairment are not classifiable for international rules. That is not an Equestrian Canada decision. That is an international decision based around some problems that were happened in other sports in the Barcelona Games. The FEI and the International Paralympic Committee are looking into it. I sit on the International Research Committee for classification, one of my other roles, and we are looking into how we classify athletes with a learning disability. Athletes with a learning disability who have a physical disability are still eligible if their physical disability is classifiable. I don't like the current rule with FEI, but that's the way it is at the moment. I'm sorry about that.
Fiona Kearney asks, are bitless bridles acceptable for video competition?
I'll have to go back and check the rules. If you email me, I'll read the rule and get back to you on that one. I don't know off the top of my head.
Linda Rolt, please give us your acronym for rhythm again.
Yes, it's a good one. It really is. Rhythm helps your two hips moving. Rhythm helps your two hips moving. And it really works. I love it because A, it means I can spell the word, and B, it reminds me what rhythm and therapeutic riding is all about.
Lena Bellavo asks, is there a list of coaches who are familiar with para? I have struggled to find coaches who have experience with para.
No, there isn't. We do not have a current recognized list. At the moment, I'm working on, EC and I are working on a qualification for para coaches. And we do know of where the para coaches, although we don't have an official list. If you email Jamie Ann in the office and tell her where you are, we'll see if we can get some help to you, even if it's only remotely.
Lori Blake asks, is there any info available about cost and expenses riders and supporters can expect at the different levels of competition?
No, there is no list available. I'm sure if you talk to, because it does vary from area to area, and transport costs and stabling fees are pretty challenging. It is on my list to put together not the costs, but a checklist of what it will cost you. Watch this space on that one.
Do we have any other questions from anybody? If we have no further questions, oh, maybe one just came in. Oh, no, it's great. If we have no further questions, we thank everybody for your time tonight. We hope you've enjoyed this session and found Clive as knowledgeable and entertaining as I do. We do want to remind everybody that we're hoping to have these sessions on a more frequent basis. So this is the first in a series that we're planning to offer. So please keep an eye out on your email and on the Equestrian Canada announcements for future sessions. Anybody looking for COVID resources or information can visit the Equestrian Canada website. There's a number of different documents with information available for everybody on that website. So please take some time and look at what mental health options, facility operation information, and please don't forget, if you can, make a donation to the For the Herd fundraiser that's being offered through Ontario Equestrian. You can see the website on the screen, www.fortheherd.ca. Again, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much indeed.